Hi, everyone. Welcome to the CSPI podcast. I'm here today with Alec Stapp from the Institute of Progress. Alec, how you doing?
Good. How you doing, Richard?
I'm doing great. So I met you. I think we knew each other from Twitter beforehand, but I met you at the Emergent Ventures conference in DC a few months ago. We're both, products of Emergent Venture grants and sort of the Tyler Cohen network.
Definitely.
And I've always been interested in your Twitter feed, and I was interested that you told me you were going to start Institute for Progress at the time, and I was looking forward to it, and it's finally here. I guess the first question I want to ask is: you announced on January 20, right?
Yeah, it sounds right. Yeah, 8 days ago. So, yep, January 20th.
Yeah, we're recording this 28th. So why a Thursday? Because I usually announce stuff on Monday or Tuesday. Because my theory has always been you get most possible attention because the weekend everything sort of resets. So why did you go with the Thursday? I think that's an interesting choice.
That's a great question. Yeah, so we were also planning for a Monday 2 months ago. We were planning for that Monday that week, so 4 days earlier. And then one of us checked the calendar. And we're like, wait, that's Martin Luther King Day. That's a bad idea, obviously, to launch on a holiday.
Insensitive.
Yeah, and so then we switched to the Tuesday, and this is the classic like the website's not quite ready. You don't want to make sure all your ducks in a row are ready before you launch. The content is very good and finalized, and so we ended up pushing just a couple days. And we thought basically Fridays, you definitely don't want to launch on a Friday because people are kind of checked out for new things, and we didn't want to wait till the following Monday. And so
Hmm.
our theory is basically that if you have a large platform on Twitter and a lot of supporters who have prominent audiences themselves who want to help boost your message, it doesn't matter that much. Like as long as it's not a Friday or a holiday, or there's not like major breaking news. And so the only thing that would have prevented us from launching on that Thursday was if like probably something on the level of like Justice Breyer announcing his retirement, where like that's
Hmm.
all anyone wants to talk about on Twitter, and they might see your thing but not be like as excited about it or talk about it. But besides that, we feel confident enough in our audience and our supporters' audiences that we can get our message out there.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the people probably who are paying attention to your think tank and people who are paying attention to what I'm doing and what we're doing at CSPI, I think those are 24/7 kind of people when it comes to politics. I think they're very passionate. So a Saturday is not that different from a Monday. Maybe if you're doing something broader, I don't know. Who knows if it's even true. Just someone told me Monday or Tuesday is best. I said that makes intuitive sense, and that's sort of the rule I've been going by. But who really knows? I mean, it's not empirically tested.
Yeah.
So yeah, so why start a think tank out of all the things you can do with your life?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a couple. I'll take it from two angles, I guess. One personal and one more macro level. So on a personal level, I think you should think about as an individual in your own career how you can have the most impact and what skills you have that differentiate you from others, and the classic like what's your competitive advantage in the marketplace. And so both me and my co-founder Caleb Watney, we worked in think tanks for the last 5 or 6 years in DC, and so we've seen a lot of that ecosystem. And that's where our skill set comes from, doing like a lot of research and advocacy on technology and innovation issues. And we've kind of seen the inner workings of how these organizations work. We've had the pleasure of working at a lot of great institutions. But once you're on the inside, you also, people like us have a lot of strong opinions. Caleb and I both have interests in a lot of different policy areas beyond just narrowly defined technology and innovation policy. And so we've been talking for a couple of years now about like, what if one day we did our own thing? How differently would we run it? Like, and the cool thing about starting a new institution is that you can start with a clean slate. So taking over something that was pre-existing would be a lot harder to kind of turn it around or change the inertia or momentum of a pre-existing institution. And so we were really excited to start from a clean slate, hire the very best people from day one, start a new mission, and really just build out a new institution. And we were also felt the increasing desire for new institutions in DC. So a lot of people are very excited about funding, supporting, and promoting work from new organizations as well. And so we thought the time was right for that and decided to pull the trigger last summer.
Yeah. So yeah, I encourage people to announce your sort of a mission statement. It's progress is a policy choice by you and Caleb, and you guys are focusing on three topics, right? Mostly. Is it exclusively those three? Hard of a rule is that? Like if someone comes at you with something great about housing to do a report, because you do that construction stuff, right? And that doesn't fall under meta science, biosecurity, or immigration. So these are just sort of guideposts. They're not all inclusive of everything you're doing.
Correct. Yeah, they're actually where there's the starting areas. And so we have our long run plan is to be a general purpose think tank and work on every major policy area that we deem as important and we can add value to the debate. Our mission statement is very broad. We are a think tank dedicated to accelerating scientific, technological, and industrial progress while safeguarding humanity's future. And so it's very broad and can encompass a lot of different things. For the first three policy areas that you mentioned, so meta science, how do we fund science? How do we change the incentives of science? Immigration, how do we get more, in particular, scientists, doctors, engineers to come to the US? How do we be proactive about high skilled immigration? And then on the third area, biosecurity, a lot of that is how do we prevent future pandemics? How do we mitigate their effects? And then also, how do we accelerate some of the low hanging fruit in biotech? How do we do really cool things, with mRNA technology or CRISPR? And so those are our three areas to start, but we wanted just people to show progress, show that our model works in those areas, and kind of focus the organization on three areas that we deem important, neglected, and tractable, which is kind of an effective altruist framework for thinking about which issues in the world to work on. But we definitely plan on adding new areas over time. So you mentioned housing. I would say urbanism as a policy category area is one of the likeliest areas we expand into next. And then I'd probably add climate and energy to that as well as an area that we think is sufficiently important that if we found the right person to lead that area for us, we'd add it pretty quickly.
Uh-huh. So when you're trying to be a policy, relevant think tank, there's the stuff you do that's sort of outer facing. You write reports, you promote them on social media, you appear on podcasts, you're part of the discourse. And this might be a boring or easy question for somebody a little bit more familiar with sort of the inner workings of DC. What goes on behind the scenes of a successful think tank in trying to influence policy, and what are you guys going to do that's the same or different?
Yeah, that's a very good question because it's hard for outsiders to understand how it works. I think a lot of our friends are in Silicon Valley or work in tech or adjacent fields, and they're often skeptical of DC. It's known as the swamp, or it's known as like it's just gridlock. Nothing gets done in DC. It's mostly a barrier or a bottleneck to progress or innovation, and they don't see it enabling a lot of stuff. And we think that's misguided or at least a distorted view of what happens in DC. So first, what we do differently, I think. We do a lot of the standard think tank things in terms of the research and advocating, directly in person on the Hill or at government agencies. But we're actually tilted more towards that behind the scenes game because we've built a structure for our think tank where the stakeholders are aligned with us on that. And so what I mean by that is that the traditional think tank funding model is being funded by individuals, corporations, and foundations, some mix of those three funding sources. And oftentimes you're working with professional program managers at those organizations who need to justify their own jobs. And they need to tell their boss, like, here's an output that I got from the think tank on X, Y, or Z issue. It's extremely hard to measure actual policy impact. Did that legible output actually affect a policy outcome? Very hard to know. And oftentimes, the person doesn't really care about the policy impact. They want to just do a good job and make their bosses happy, which is reasonable, of course. But we actually do really care about having policy impact and not maximizing just for explicit deliverables. There are a lot of webinars during COVID. We think webinars in general are kind of overrated in terms of do people actually watch them or attend them? But it's an easy thing that people can check box for a donor and say, we did a thing that we committed to doing. Or we'll definitely write research papers, but should we commit 12 months ahead of time to writing a 40-page paper on X topic? Not necessarily if it's not the right time to deliver new research on that, or if the legislative cycle is not attuned to it. And so we're doing much more flexible behind the scenes things, like working closely with legislative staff on, the way policymaking works in DC now is we have these every year we have a few must-pass pieces of omnibus legislation where they just pack everything from a ton of different policy areas into one bill. And so can you insinuate yourself into that process, tweak things on the margin here or there, edit language, make helpful recommendations? You often can't drive that process because then you're an annoying voice in the room. But if you can align yourselves with the policymaker staff and say, what are your guys' goals? Okay, here's where we have overlap. And we can help you. We can be what the term is legislative subsidy to you all. We can help you with expertise. We can help you with time and resources to help you advance your goals so long as they overlap with our think tank's goals. And it's a lot of that quiet behind the scenes work. And the last thing I'll add to that is it's a lot of coordinating with other partners. So as a small new think tank, we rely on working with great all the other think tanks like the Federation of American Scientists, Schmidt Futures. Zach Graves from Lincoln Network is on our board as well on the center right. He does great work for his think tank. And so often you can have more of an impact in DC policy world if you're coming as a chorus of voices and saying like, we all as quote unquote experts agree that this is the best policy, and that helps push the ball forward with staff.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So you guys are, you said, are sort of working on the margins. You're suggesting things. You're providing ideas to the staff. But who writes the meat of the bill? It's the staff for, like, okay, so you have a congressman, you have Smith, and so he has somebody on his staff. They're not like career professionals. Like Smith finds them. And Smith and Jones are congressmen, and Smith and Jones is they're like top legislative person basically writes this. Is there like a specialized bureaucratic class that writes basically the laws in this country? Is that how it works? Are there career officials? Just sort of explain it to me, like I know nothing, because I don't.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, I mean, these are not like career civil servants in the sense that you'd find in like regulatory agencies that have been around for 40 years and stick with the same jobs regardless of who's wins elections. I mean, these are politically appointed staff. So the people writing the bills are either on committees, which are the most important staffers. A committee, say if it's a bill related to healthcare, from the HELP committee, the H stands for healthcare. The committee staff there will probably take point on controlling the legislative text of that particular bill. And then obviously leadership offices, bills in DC are very leadership driven. A lot of rank and file members now complain they don't have enough input in the process, but it's just a reality on the ground that because it's this, again, omnibus must pass situation, the leadership of both parties, whoever's in power, feel they want to have tight reins on the actual drafting process and horse trading process. And so getting into talking to staffers and leadership offices on committee staff is the most important. And those people often have been around for a long time, so they have a lot of expertise. So again, I don't want to conflate them with like quote unquote deep state or like people who are civil servants for decades, but they often have a lot of experience. And it really is a highly technical skill of how to write legislative language correctly that won't break other pieces. They're all interconnected and interdependent upon each other. Every clause is referencing another clause, right? And so it's highly technical language. Some of the think tanks we respect the most have people on staff at their think tanks who have had that job before when they previously worked on Capitol Hill. And so having people like that in your network who can know what a helpful suggestion is versus a unhelpful suggestion during that process is really key.
Yeah, one thing I really like about your think tank is it's very meta aware of sort of what it's doing, in the sense that, you say we have these issues and we pick these issues for these specific reasons. And you even do a little bit of a sort of political analysis of, what makes sense and what's feasible and what's not. So when I look at the three main topics, you start with biosecurity, meta science, and immigration. It seems to me that two of them are not clearly politicized, right? Meta science and biosecurity. I think, I don't think anyone's going to get hot on cable news over
Right.
either one of those things. Immigration is a little bit different. So the border is, the most polarized thing, right? Illegal immigration is the most polarized, but still, like everything about immigration is to a large extent polarized. You often find even denunciations of high-skilled immigration among Republican congressmen and media personalities. So, what was the sort of thinking behind including immigration as an issue with the other two? Because it's, I know you're trying to be sort of nonpartisan, and the issue is important, but there could be risks there of rubbing people the wrong way. How did you think about like including that in your issues that you publicize as motivating the think tank?
Yeah, I agree with your assessment there. I think it's definitely more polarized and more partisan than the other two of our first three starting issues. I think one is just recognition that how important we view this issue. So using that framework of neglected, tractable, and importance. This is one of the less tractable, but it's just so important. Amount of human capital and talent we have in the country really is a driving factor of future innovation and economic growth. And so recognizing it's just extremely high on the importance scale. And then I think we're going to spend a lot of our time focusing more on the high skilled end of the immigration debate, which we think is more tractable than the rest of the debate. Like you mentioned, the border is very controversial as a topic, very heated, extremely partisan. And we support immigration of all levels, but we want to move the ball forward where we can. And so you can do that in two ways on high skilled immigration. One, obviously legislative or through executive action. And so right now there are a few bills going through Congress that have elements and provisions that increase the number of green cards available for high skilled immigrants, especially for STEM graduate students. And so we'll see if those actually stay in the final bills as they get passed. And whether they do or not, we think there's a lot of scope for action on the executive side. And so this is where, it's not, because it's the executive and a Democratic administration, it doesn't matter that much if it activates the right in negative polarization sense, because the scope for action is so large. And so we think that on the O1 visa, for example, the Biden administration announced reforms just a few days ago that they're trying to make it more explicit process for immigrants of extraordinary ability to come to the United States. It's an uncapped visa program. And the hardest part about it is people don't know, like, what does it mean to have extraordinary ability? How do you define that? What will an adjudication officer determine that you fit the bill? And these applications can often run up to 400 pages because people don't know what they need to prove. And so the Biden administration is adding clarity to that. We think that's amazing because we do think that there's huge value in bringing the next startup entrepreneur or the next engineer or scientist to the United States. We are the global R&D lab. We create so much technology that is really a public good for the world. And we want to keep the US at the frontier of technology. And then the last thing I'll note is that if you look at polling, immigration is obviously controversial. A majority of Americans support either keeping immigration levels the same or increasing them. But the minority who are opposed to immigration and want to reduce immigration often rank it as a more important issue. So there's like an intensity of preferences mismatch here, even though a majority of Americans do support more immigration. But if you ask them about high skilled immigration, the margins go way up. And even a majority of Republicans support increasing high skilled immigration. And I believe across Americans as a whole, it's greater than 70% of Americans support high skilled immigration and think that it strengthens our country. And so by focusing on that issue, we think we can get more bipartisan support and actually make it a more tractable issue.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think if you look at the polling, it's hard to find opposition to high-skilled immigration. Although, some of the most motivated, to participate in politics, there are a lot of people who don't like immigration, who thinks it's the number one issue, and a lot of them are in the commentariat or public intellectuals of sorts, and those people are hostile. But yeah, exactly. The public opinion for shutting off high-skilled immigration, it's just not there. And so I guess you're right. It can be a tractable issue if you think about it. You think about it from that perspective. The other thing, that's fascinating that I found in your, sort of introductory article, you talked about the secret Congress. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that figures into your thinking?
Yeah, for sure. This is an idea we actually borrowed from Matt Iglesias and Simon Bazelon. They published this in Matt's Substack newsletter called Slow Boring, I believe, last summer. And it's kind of an idea that's been pretty influential in our thinking. And it's basically just spelling out, again, like, how does modern legislating work in DC? Like, obviously, we have a whole different conversation about rulemaking and the regulatory process post when a bill becomes a law. But at the legislative stage, like, how does a bill become a law in the modern American context? And what I think Matt and Simon persuasively argue is that there's this weird paradox where the issues that are talked about the least, especially on like cable news or by political pundits, those are the issues that you actually can move the ball forward and are more tractable because it doesn't activate a lot of this negative polarization. And so the secret in secret Congress means like you don't want to talk about it too much because that just decreases the odds that you'll actually get things done. And I believe there's actually now I'm thinking about Ezra Klein had a piece early in the Obama years about the bully pulpit, and it was published in the New Yorker. And it was just talking about how when Obama talked about it, and he made a big speech about a particular piece of legislation, the political scientists analyzed that and showed that the odds of it passing actually went down because it, again, activated that negative polarization. And so the one spin on this thesis, and I don't think it's actually made it in the launch essay. We've cut a bit of our theory of change and stuff. But what we would add to that is that actually we think there's a sweet spot of salience. Because a lot of people will tell us then, like, so why would you do a think tank? Why are you on Twitter if like talking about things makes them less likely to happen? Like, should you just like shut down what you're doing and not participate?
Yeah.
And it might be a little biased, of course, because this is our job. But we do think there's actually a sweet spot of having some salience, but not too much. Mm-hmm. And the sweet spot for us is that I think in this horse trading omnibus must pass legislative process, and again, these are like the annual appropriations bill, the Defense Reauthorization Act. A reconciliation bill is treated almost as quasi must pass legislation because it's the one opportunity to get your wish list passed each year. In these contexts, you do need to persuade staffers and professionals in DC that your idea is a priority. And as the cutting happens from the top line revenue levels, when there's a lot of horse trading happening, that your idea doesn't get dropped and left behind as the train leaves the station. And
Mm.
so we think that's why the elite conversation on Twitter matters so much. Actually, participating in the discourse matters because you need to convince during a Democratic administration, you need to convince Democratic staffers and their bosses that these are popular ideas for the party. At the very least, won't hurt them in elections, but hopefully will help them in elections, and that it's within the Overton window. And this is what a good Democrat or a good Republican would be willing to endorse in this
Mm.
process. The thing you don't want to do is you don't want to push it so hard that it gets on Rachel Maddow, Tucker Carlson. If you want any kind of bipartisan support for your bill, which you don't always need, but sometimes do, that's the kiss of death. And so we think there's a sweet spot right in the middle.
Yeah, it's sort of the theory is sort of it's sort of intention with sort of democratic ideals about how things are supposed to work, right? It's like if the elites can get together and just sort of reason with each other, they can do smart things. If the masses notice too much, it's gonna screw everything up, right? How do you think about that? Is it just sort of a tension you just have to deal with? And, I mean, you're not a political philosopher, so you don't have to answer for this. You're just a person trying to have impact in the real world. But how much
Yeah,
do you think about this, and how do you think about it?
yeah, that's a fair tension to point out. I would say one, I would put more of the onus on. I think there are a lot of demagogues out there. I'm not a big fan of the populist swing in either political party. I think they exploit things in bad faith. And so, yes, you can get a lot of people riled up, which in some sense is democratic, but I think oftentimes it's just highly distorted and again just bad faith process. And two, I would say that looking at what's popular, what actually gets done, like preventing the next pandemic, would that be popular if you pulled Americans? Like
No.
this current pandemic cost the American economy $16 trillion, estimate from Harvard economists last year, and look at excess death numbers. 1 million Americans have died. Okay, so should we spend $6 billion a year over 10 years to prevent or extremely mitigate the next pandemic? I think that's a great investment. It would very likely be popular if you were to talk to a lot of Americans, but it's just not a short-term enough window for the current process to recognize or prioritize. And so it's our job to help bring in those future horizons and say, these are really long-run things that matter a lot. If you were able to have a conversation with the average American, I think we could actually persuade them these are popular and good for the country. But the short-term, narrow political incentives don't actually create always that great policymaking outcome. And so that's how we insert ourselves into the process.
Yeah, that's fair, right? A lot of whatever, it's not like anyone has a monopoly on saying, just because they're the loudest voices or the thing that gets the most public salience at any one point. I mean, you can't just point that and say, oh, that's the most democratic thing. That's what the people want. You're right. The participants in the process are, distorting and influencing the process itself. So, yeah, I think that all makes sense. Um, just go, this just going back. I mean, you touched on this a little bit, but the idea that, you're trying to not be too salient, but also the problem is if you can't motivate people, right? If you're not exciting enough, people aren't going to care enough. Um, and so do you worry that if anything things exist the way they do in DC, policy is the way it is for a reason. Presumably, somebody thought at some point that it made sense to do things a certain way, or there was some bureaucratic interest, or there was some public opinion reason why things had to be set up in one way and not the other. And so it's not I don't think it's as easy as somebody can just walk right in and say this is a bad idea, let's do something else. You have to provide some motivation to politicians or policy staff or whoever is making these decisions. So how do you think about that? How do you think about not being too salient, but also motivating people enough to affect change?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I think maybe I'll expand on something I mentioned a bit earlier, which is that one, just at base, we have an incrementalist philosophy at the Institute for Progress, our new think tank, which is, wins on the margin in public policy matter so much. I think anyone promising whole scale reform, abolishing certain institutions or radical change, one, they're often likely to create more harm than good if they were able to achieve that because of unintended consequences. And the whole Chesterton's fence argument of like, why was this here in the first place? If you don't fully understand it, you shouldn't remove the fence. But two, it's highly unrealistic and extremely unlikely to happen because, like you said, there were certain forces that created that rule or law or institution in the first place. And so we think incremental improvement is the path forward. And it's not just like incremental sounds small and like, oh, is that even important? Doesn't matter. But even incremental improvements in Washington, D.C. public policy in particular, and that's why we don't focus on state and local policy and why we don't do international policy. One, we want to just focus so we can, actually develop expertise and have an impact. But we also think this is the most important lever to pull in global policy because so many other countries follow U.S. policy. If U.S. policy gets things right on tech and innovation, those create global public goods that spill over the rest of the world. So there are myriad reasons why DC policy is the most important, and incremental reforms matter. And then, like, how do you get those incremental reforms? Working with policymakers, you can't impose yourself onto the process. Like, these people are very busy, they have hard jobs, they're underpaid, and most staffers, even if they focus on, they're lucky if they get just only healthcare. Often, many staffers have multiple policy areas they cover, but even if they're lucky enough to cover healthcare is an insanely complex, huge field, and it's hard to expect a 25-year-old to actually have real expertise in that area. So they need help, but they can't just go in any direction. People have this like view of DC that lobbyists just run things. I think that's overstated. When you're influencing the process, you need to first identify what is their boss's goal, what do they care about, why do they care about it? Is it because they have companies in their district, their home district, that employ a lot of people and create good jobs for them? What is their political philosophy, ideology? What issues matter to them? And if you can align yourself with that and show them that you're helping them and making their jobs easier, then you're much more likely to get the incremental change you want to see happen. And so that's how we kind of view the process, is like kind of picking and choosing, really being really flexible of who we're working with, and finding partners that we can help them advance their goals while we're advancing our own goals.
Yeah. So just to go back to what you said again, I keep going back to the idea of like who the policy staff is and what they're doing. So you said they're 25 years old, I heard, and they're underpaid, which this seems like very important. It seems like they are the ones who basically write the laws for the country, and they're just underpaid 25-year-olds right out of college. Is that right, or are they more experienced people working above them? Like who I'm trying to see the lay of the land and basically how.
Yeah. So maybe I'll say that the median staffer is a 25-year-old on Capitol Hill. But definitely the people who are doing the primary drafting are often older. So these are more like mid-30s, I would say. And they do often have like, a decade of experience or more because it's such a complex, demanding job. But their support staff and like the teams of people in the congressional offices, these are mostly people in their 20s. Because I saw a report recently that the median House staffer salary is under $60,000. It's like $58,000 per year or something, which, isn't that, it's it's below median household income in the United States. But then you need to also remember that DC is an expensive cost of living city, and these are all almost exclusively college educated and sometimes graduate education jobs. And so the opportunity cost is much higher. They could go get paid much more in the private sector. And the hours are grueling on Capitol Hill. They have to often work evenings and weekends, and it's just insanely demanding. And so, yeah, they need help. And if you can be helpful to them in the right way that helps them advance their goals, then you can be much more successful.
And the people who get these jobs, so like when you're like a Supreme Court clerk, usually you're the person who went to the top law schools and you were like first in your class, and then you go clerk for Ginsburg or Scalia, or people who are not anymore anyways, but other Supreme Court justices. Are these people like, are they just hiring sort of state school graduates? Are they like, if you're like the smartest conservative at Harvard, is going on the policy staff something you would do, or not really? I'm just trying to get an idea of like the kind of people who fill these jobs.
Yeah, I would say maybe put them in two different buckets. Yeah, like the Supreme Court clerks are definitely in a whole category of their own. Like they're almost exclusively hiring like the top conservatives or liberals graduating from Ivy League schools, who served on like law reviews and things like that. There are so many more jobs on Capitol Hill. staffers, communication staffers, legislative
How many? So,
directors.
like, how many would like McConnell have, and how many would Schumer have, and how many would like the typical congressman or senator have? Just ballpark. You don't have to like give me exact
Ballpark.
number.
I think for leadership, it's like more than a dozen, maybe up to a couple dozen.
Huh.
And then in the smaller, like just rank and file members, they have 6 to 10 kind of full time staff. And then you
Yeah.
also have to remember that committee staff are full time, so there are people who they just work for the committee, not necessarily a particular member of Congress. And those are the more senior jobs. Those are the jobs that pay more. They're the most desirable jobs in DC, and both the majority and minority party on the committee have their own staff as well. Whether you're in the majority or minority depends how many paid staff positions you get for that. And so it varies widely by how senior is your member on certain committees, and are they in leadership, of course. And it's for those jobs, for the entry level jobs, the sorting mechanism is much less like, did you go to an Ivy League school? It's, are you willing to work for $30,000 a year in Washington, D.C., even though you're a college graduate? Which is, we advocate, it's not a primary issue for us, but we're definitely supporters of increasing pay for these kinds of positions, because we want the best people. We want to be able to recruit the best to serve in government. And two, you don't want this filtering mechanism to be whose parents can give them money to support, paying their rent in DC when it's so expensive, and things like that. And so often it's who's willing to take the unpaid internship, who's willing to work long hours for low pay, and it creates bad outcomes sometimes.
Yeah, that's interesting. That seems like there's a one of your categories, meta science. There's sort of like meta governance, right? You could think of, and like this is like a meta governance issue. So yeah, I mean, who's actually writing the laws and who has power in DC? It's something we don't think a lot about. We see the Supreme Court, we see Congress, but obviously congressmen are not spending all their time writing the bills and negotiating themselves, right? Someone else has to do that work. So it's interesting to learn about that. I mean, I know a lot about politics, but I don't know DC as well as you do. One place. So we talked about the legislature. Where does but the other place where policy gets made, there's the bureaucracy, right? So how do you think about working or influencing the federal bureaucracy? If you do that, you talked a little bit about executive agencies. Maybe just talk a little more about that.
Yeah, for sure, because it's a whole different beast. And oftentimes for public policy, the rulemaking process and regulatory process is even more important than the legislative process. Because again, we don't pass that many bills annually anymore. They're large and they matter, but oftentimes Congress is kicking the can down the road, or like leaving a lot of discretion open to the agencies themselves. Under the Chevron deference doctrine, the agencies have pretty wide latitude in how they interpret their mandates. And so, helping again the regulatory agencies advance their own goals and providing expertise to them is often the best method to do that. And so that at previous think tanks, that involved a lot of things like submitting public comments during the notice and comment period. Whenever a new rule is proposed, the agency has to allow for public comment over a multi-week or multi-month period. And often when they do finalize the rulemaking, they cite in footnotes justifications for why they made a particular decision. They cite public comments that were submitted. And, public comments vary by issue. Like on the net neutrality thing, there were thousands and thousands of public comments of people just being like, I support net neutrality, or some people saying I oppose net neutrality. But on most of these issues, it's like a small handful of people writing, not one or two sentences, but like 10 to 20 pages of like well-cited, well-supported, well-evidenced research of why a regulation or new rulemaking should look a certain way. So you can provide your expertise to actually influence that process. But again, I would say a lot of it's insider-outsider dynamic. So if you have connections to certain individuals, usually political appointees, in those agencies, and you're talking to them, you can say, what are the political battles you're fighting internally, and how can we help you win them? Because a lot of people think that there's like the Green Lantern theory of change, where it's just like, if the head of an agency wants something to happen, it's like just going to happen automatically. And often you have to think about like, these people don't actually as individuals have much power. They have to coordinate with a lot of different actors in the political system. And so often they're making tons of trade-offs based on who has the most political power or who's winning the argument of the day. And so you got to find your champions for your issues in the regulatory agencies and then give them as much ammunition as possible, and talk to them often about like what would be helpful to you, like screen an idea with them and say, if we came out with like this, would that actually help you or hurt you in your political battle? I think a lot of times people don't realize like they're actually doing more harm than good, because the person internally, it would be your idea or your paper or your whatever would actually work in the opposite of the intended direction. And so
Mm.
really coordinating closely with insiders who are your champions is a big part of our philosophy for regulatory change.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds like yeah, it sounds like the process just matters. So let me ask this: is it like do you feel like when they're yeah, so it seems like the process is very like it requires specific on the ground knowledge, right? Like me, I live in California. If I just sat here and started submitting comments to agencies for various things, like I have no idea what the influence of that would be. Like maybe I'd make good arguments, and maybe on average it would be good, but it seems like I don't have sort of the localized knowledge, the relationships. If I don't know anybody in the agency, I might be hurting my cause, or I might be having no effect at all. So it sounds like sort of your theory of change and what you're doing and why you specifically have to. How where exactly in DC are you? You're
My office that I'm currently in right now, we are by the Noma Metro, so we're just north of the Capitol. But I can walk to the Capitol in less than 10 minutes.
Yeah. So I've spent some, yeah, I don't know DC that well. I've spent some time there, but I've been around like the think tank space and Capitol Hill. And it's interesting how clustered it is, right? It's all within, literally blocks. So what I'm getting from what you're saying is basically that's very, very necessary. You need to have these personal relationships. You need to know what's going on in whatever agency, you're trying to influence, in addition to knowing the policy specifics and knowing your stuff and thinking about the politics, right? So it's sort of a it makes sense that you are where you are. You really couldn't do it from anywhere else. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, I can't overemphasize this enough that when we were thinking about starting this institution, I mean, we started it during COVID, and so a lot of companies and other organizations are going fully remote, and people often try to influence the policy. Like you're a part of the discourse, the political discourse in the United States, and you're in California, so people do participate from around the country and around the world. But we think really, if your goal is to have policy impact and you're starting a new organization, and your goal is to influence U.S. federal policy, you kind of have to be on the ground in D.C., and so we can't be fully remote. So we have two full-time staffers in addition to Caleb and myself. When we posted those jobs and we're doing the recruiting process, we were clear that you have to be able to do in-person meetings in DC. We have our staff come in at least 3 days a week to the office. And yeah, it's because DC runs on personal relationships. It runs on trust. You need to be able to get a coffee or grab a drink with a congressional staffer or someone in an agency at a moment's notice to get their feedback on something. And just being in person helps build that trust and that rapport. And yeah, I'll just use a concrete example of like Caleb, my co-founder, is running. He leads our immigration portfolio, and something he's been doing a lot of work on is called the International Entrepreneur Rule, which was a rule that was started in the Obama administration, went dormant during the Trump administration, and now is coming back under the Biden administration. Basically, it's just a way to bring more entrepreneurs to the United States, and it's the closest thing we have to like a startup visa that a lot of other developed countries have already. And it's currently an executive rule, but it needs to be kind of cemented into law. And so we're trying to push for some legislative action on this. So it can't be just overturned in the next Republican administration. And so what Caleb is doing is creating a coalition of partners, other think tanks who are supportive of this rule, immigration attorneys who work in this area full time. And, that's the group you need to understand how this rulemaking works, as well as some immigrants and student groups, and really bringing all these partners to the table. And then Caleb is drafting coalition letters, op-eds, articles, and then he's talking to people inside USCIS and saying, would this be helpful to you all as you're looking at new immigration regulations? And so kind of screening with them ahead of time. And so people don't understand this, that anyone, if you have a good idea and you have substantive feedback to help, oftentimes you just email people in the agencies and say, can I meet with you on this substantive matter to discuss it? They will meet with you. You can't waste their time. And I can't say they'll always say yes, but oftentimes, way more than you would think, they're willing to meet with you to discuss policy matters. And that's when you filter and say, would this be helpful? What are your goals? How can we be of assistance to you on these processes? And so being in DC is just instrumental for that.
Yeah, that is yeah, very interesting. Do you see yourself sort of as a you're sort of a a beachhead or sort of an infiltrator that has a little bit of a bad connotation, but you're sort of a representative of people who aren't necessarily naturally attracted to politics. I mean, I meet people in business or I meet people in tech, and it seems like this progress, the idea of progress studies, and like effective altruism, which is the other sort of intellectual current that I think you guys are coming out of. They're outside DC, right? So progress studies was thought up basically by Patrick Collison and Tyler Cohen. Effective altruism, I don't know the history of that, but it started in the Bay Area. I'm
There's a strong community in the Bay Area. I would say the main intellectual foundation is actually in Oxford. There are institutions there, Global Priorities Institute and others. This is Nick Bostrom, Will McCaskill, Toby Ord.
Yeah.
A lot of the founding thinkers who've written the seminal texts in effective altruism are in the. I would say so. I'd say number one, Oxford. Number two, the Bay Area.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah. So not DC, right?
Not DC. No, there's a burgeoning community, but it's definitely smaller.
Yeah. Though Tyler is, from George Mason, which is in the area that I don't think we consider him part of the DC scene. So
Right.
yeah, so you're sort of like the representative of these people with great ideas, interesting ideas, who haven't had much representation in politics. Especially the highest level of politics. These sort of the sort of the being inside the system. Um, and so do you think about like do you think about you as like yourself as like, in all humility, sort of like as a pioneer, like you're making other people think that, okay, you can actually take ideas and translate them into policy. Like, okay, like the culture war stuff will always be there. The foreign policy stuff will always be there. People will always debate that, and people attracted to that stuff will always want to be around DC and want to do stuff on that. But you're making another kind of sort of politics and influence possible. Do you guys see yourselves like that?
Definitely, that's definitely what we aspire to be. And I think, like I said, Caleb and I, we've been friends for at least 4 years now. And we've been working together. We worked together at the Progressive Policy Institute in our last job for more than a year, worked very closely together. And then we talk about this kind of stuff all the time. And we would say, like, where is the progress studies think tank? Where is the effective altruism think tank in DC? And for progress studies, probably the closest thing people would say is Mercatus, because that's Tyler Cowen's think tank affiliated with George Mason University. But really, again, for path dependence reasons, probably more than anything else, like Mercatus is known as a libertarian think tank in DC. They're a large institution, and that's a brand they're proud of. They do great work, but they're not going to change overnight to become more of this emphasis on state capacity and, definitely not coded as libertarian progress studies issues that we care about. And so there's really no other actor in the space that we think was doing that kind of work in DC. And then on effective altruism, there are definitely single issue think tanks that do great work. So I'm thinking of Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown, which is a new think tank started in the last few years. They do great work on national security and technology, in particular artificial intelligence and kind of the race with China on technology issues. And Employ America, they do macroeconomic policy, very influential in Federal Reserve nominations process and other macro level issues. Very small team dedicated to that one issue, doing great work. But no multi-issue effective altruist think tank. And so we just kept looking around and being like, if not us, then who, right? Why hasn't this happened yet? And so it could have been, maybe it's a bad idea and doesn't need to exist, but we thought it was a good idea. And we decided not to wait around anymore. And I'm actually talking to one of our friends, Mark Lutter, who's founder of the Charter Cities Institute. He really gave us the final push we needed early last summer to say, look, like guys, like there are donors who want to support new institutions. And this is an idea that needs to happen. I think you guys are well suited to do it. And that kind of just gave us the last final shove to be like, yeah, let's pull the trigger on this.
Yeah. That was similar to my thinking in starting CSPI. I was basically talking to people, and I was not happy with sort of a lot of social science and how it was being done. And I'm like, somebody should do this other organization that's doing something else. And they're like, well, what about you? And I said, I don't know. And then I finally said, okay, what about me? Yeah, you get used to the idea eventually. So I mean, I guess a word of advice to anyone out there: just because no one has done something before that sounds like a good idea, doesn't mean it can't be done, right? It just means that no one has done it. And if everyone thinks, why should it be me? You can imagine there's a lot of sort of complacency and inertia, and the kind of and like risk aversion and the kinds of things people do.
Totally. Yeah, I would just to add on that a little bit, because it's an issue I feel passionate about, is that I think the median person in DC and even the median American is way too risk averse. Like I would say, like even irrationally risk averse.
Yeah.
People view so many things as to borrow a metaphor. I think from I first heard from Jeff Bezos at Amazon is like. Um, People think of so many things as one-way doors. Like if you make this decision and walk through the door, you can never go back, and like you're committed to this like future life path forever. And the vast majority of decisions in life are two-way doors. You can go through. If things don't work out, you can come back the same door and like start over, or try again, try something else. And so I think people should just take more risks, start new things. If it doesn't work out, failure is okay,
Yeah.
as long as you act with integrity and try your best. Most people will just respect you more for trying in the first place, and you'll have opportunities. And so Caleb and I realized, like, if this doesn't work out, we can get other think tank jobs. We have good networks. People support our work, want to see us succeed. And so we think we have a very high chance of success, and we're confident in the odds of our institution being here in 10 years and being much larger. But even in the worst case scenario where it doesn't work out, we're okay with that. And I think that I want to encourage a lot of my friends and people I know to take more risks. And, if things don't work out, like you're going to be okay, even though it seems scary.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one thing that made me sort of less risk averse in life was reading some evolutionary theory somewhere, which basically the idea that why humans are sort of pathologically risk averse and just the way we're living today is because if you think about the environment where we were evolutionarily adapting to, so like you get nervous about talking to some person, right? The idea was in the distant past you would only have like a small village, and if you made a fool out of yourself, right, you would be kicked out of the village. If you went and you talked to the wrong woman who was attractive, she was paired up with the strongest guy in the village, he would come club you over the head, and you die, right? So it was
Right.
actually an existential, screwing up socially was actually a matter of life and death. And we bring that hardware into today's world, and we think if I start this think tank or I start this new kind of career, or there's entrepreneurial opportunity that's sort of off the path that everyone else is following, something inside you says, I'm gonna die, right? and
Yeah,
you're not gonna
totally.
die. Yes, you're not gonna die. You might waste a year or two of your life, but you'll learn something and you might actually succeed. So yeah, it's important to sort of overcome those primitive emotions and go out there and do something. And I'm glad you're doing it. Um, are you so you've had 7 days plus one. Have it open on Thursday. We're recording this on Friday, January 28th. How's the reception been so far? What have you seen? What's surprising? What's encouraging? What's maybe discouraging? What are your thoughts? Let's get them on the historical record, because 10, 20 years from now, when Institute for Progress has changed American society, we can look back and we can see what you were thinking in the first week.
Definitely, let's mark it down. I mean, I wish I had like actually written down expectations before launch, because now I'm just trying to remember like exactly what I was thinking going into it.
Yeah.
But as far as I can tell, I think for any reasonable purpose, it's exceeded my expectations significantly. A couple margins I can talk about. So one, just the reception of people on Twitter, which again is like not the only thing that matters, but for elite discourse, it really is really important for
I
civil.
think it's sort of is the only thing that matters. I mean, I look at the traffic for my website. I look at the traffic for my Substack. It's Twitter is the dominant force, and then like I look at like stories and like when Twitter like blew up. Oh, why doesn't Biden send everyone rapid COVID tests? And then it just happens. And then I saw like the N95 thing. People are like, oh, why are they talking about cloth mask? N95s work. And then like it started to happen. So I'm starting to think actually Twitter is all that matters. But yeah,
Totally.
go on.
Yeah. I'm glad you said it. You can say it. What I would say is that there's a meme also on Twitter. Funny enough, certain people like to say that Twitter isn't real life. It's a reminder that like the kinds of groups on there aren't representative of the American electorate overall. It's much more left wing, much more progressive.
Yeah.
Um, Certain minority viewpoints on both sides of the spectrum are much more well represented on Twitter than they are in the real world, quote unquote real world in America. But I think that actually as a critique that goes too far. What we like to say internally here is that
Yeah.
Twitter is actually upstream of real life. And so, like you were saying, you can get a glimpse of like where real life is going 6 months to a year ahead of time based on what people are talking about on Twitter. And so, one, you can anticipate things. You can help guide it and nudge it in a good direction, which we think is a good direction of being helpful for policymakers. And then all you need to do is keep in the back of your mind a reminder this is not representative of Americans, but it is representative of like a lot of elite discourse in at least DC politics or like New York media. And so if you're saying a policy is popular, You should definitely check opinion polling and like do adjustments for all sorts of things that make opinion polling distorted. But you shouldn't just poll Twitter, but participating in that discourse and helping nudge it in certain directions is extremely important.
Yeah. So again, yeah. Sorry, I mean to digress, but yeah, going back to your first thoughts and your impression in the first week or so doing this.
Yeah, so everybody was super supportive. I think we just got 98% positive comments, which, they tell you on the internet, never read the comments because they're usually mostly negative.
Yeah.
But yeah, we were extremely grateful. People seem excited about our project, want to help us. Probably the thing that was most surprising to me was that, we have a newsletter on our website for monthly updates. We have a contact page. And we have our emails listed there for both for individuals and for the organization. But we didn't say like, we have an internship program or we need help on X, Y, or Z. We just got flooded with messages. I'm actually still replying. So if you're listening to this and you had emailed me, I'm very sorry. I'm working through the backlog. But we got just flooded with messages, people saying like, I would love to work for free for you and help you on communications or on this research policy area because I'm excited by your vision. And I expected less than 10% of what we actually got in terms of that outreach. Because again, we didn't ask for anything in particular. And right now we don't have the capacity to absorb a lot of that. We want to stay lean. We want to stay small, at least for the near term, and grow intentionally and being careful with organizational culture. But it's just been really, really great to hear. I think we've tapped a nerve that we suspected was there, but now feel more confident. There's a lot of enthusiasm and energy for these kinds of organizations. And I think people just were really well receptive to the ideas we had, which again, I was hopeful of, but it's great to get that confirmation in the first week. This is a fortuitous time because we've been working behind the scenes on a lot of things like the reconciliation bill, and other pieces of legislation. But now also that the House just released the Competes Act, which is the partner of USICA, the United States Innovation and Competition Act, previously Endless Frontiers Act. For listeners who don't care about acronyms, this is just like the most important science and innovation legislation like the last 30 years in DC, if it passes. And there's bipartisan support for it. And so the House just released their partner bill for this. And we're like digging in the trenches, talking to partners. Caleb's taking lead on that for us, coordinating how can we improve this legislation, make it better for the issues we care about, particularly meta-science and immigration. And then I think 2 days ago, also Senator Patty Murray and Senator Richard Burr, bipartisan bill, released a biosecurity bill that's going to hopefully make a lot of improvements on the preventing future pandemics front. And so Nikki Taryn, our biosecurity person, is diving into that as well. So it's all hands on deck. It's exciting. It's busy. And we're feeling good.
Yeah, I know you talked about the Competes Act a little bit on Twitter. You said it's potentially, the very important bill for meta science. Can you talk about what's in it? What are the basics, and what are you most excited about, and what potentially can be even better?
Yeah, so just to take one example to start on the immigration front, it's increasing the number of STEM immigrants. So currently the legislation says that if you have a STEM PhD, you can get a waiver to immigrate to the United States and bypass a lot of the bureaucratic processes there. And we think that's a great add. Like you run the numbers, the value of a STEM PhD to the United States economy, especially in sensitive areas like semiconductors or artificial intelligence, like just hugely valuable for frontier technologies. We think that could be improved by expanding it to master's students. So my colleague Caleb found an interesting statistic that if you look at TSMC, which is the world-leading chips manufacturer in Taiwan, only 5% of their global workforce has a PhD, and 43% have a master's. So a plurality of the workforce has a master's. And so if that's the kind of workforce we want to be bringing to the United States and building with companies like Intel and many others in the semiconductor space, then we need to make sure that our immigration policy matches that. And so there are national security interest waivers that you can do to get around this process, as well as different kinds of green cards that we could make much larger or even uncapped for these kind of educated experts that we really would like to see.
So it's immigration. Is there anything else in Competes that's really exciting on the how we fund science or anything like that?
Yes, I mean, here's another thing. A lot of Competes is about just increasing overall science funding. We think there's a really compelling argument just from basic Econ 101 of our basic research, basic R&D is a public good, right? If left totally to the market, because the time horizon for returns are so far out in the future. Like basic research might not become commercializable for decades, and it's so hard to know what will pay off for the private market that they'll be underinvested and underfunded by the private sector. So we think that public R&D as a percentage of GDP has been falling for the last 50 years. So it used to be that the federal government, in the space age, 50s and 60s, was funding 2/3 of R&D in the United States, and private sector was only 1/3. That has flipped now, where it's now the private sector is funding 2/3. And so we think there's room to increase the funding, and then the tweak on the margin that we would like to see, that again Caleb is taking lead on, is doing some kind of like scientific lottery. So instead of doing a very bureaucratic process where PIs, primary investigators of research projects, spend more than 40% of their time just on paperwork, not on active research. It's a huge waste of their time, and it's not clear all this paperwork and bureaucracy is actually leading to better research. And so we need more evidence to show that, to prove that. We suspect it, but we need to prove it, right? So one thing we can do that other countries like New Zealand have done is reserve a small portion of R&D funding for a lottery program, where if you got denied funding, you get put in the lottery, and then you fund a small portion of those. And then if you can show that the people who win the lottery do at least as well, potentially better than those who didn't win the lottery, then you can say, what is the value of this entire bureaucratic process we have? Right. And in New Zealand, that process went very well. We think it could work in an American context also. So we're advocating for inserting a pilot program for a scientific lottery. This is, again, the meta science means applying the scientific method to how we fund science itself. And so it's doing more experimentation, randomization, diversification to see like what works. How do we get more breakthrough research? How do we make science go faster? And a lottery would be a good first step. A nice incremental improvement.
Yeah, this reminds me, I've been talking to recently Phil Tetlock and Robin Hanson about prediction markets in government, and their story is basically that they had a theory similar to yours. You would get prediction markets, you'd show that they're better than the way things are doing now, and then people would be convinced by them. And I think that they basically found is prediction markets show themselves better than the intelligence community or whatever, and so they just shut it down. They just say, enough of that, your nerd stuff. Let's go back to the way things were. So it's always a danger in public policy.
Yeah, I think that definitely I'm familiar with that history as well, and that definitely has a risk of happening. But I would say it was almost like we went through a prediction markets winter, and maybe I'm in a bubble, but I feel like there's a lot of renewed enthusiasm and funding for really cool projects in prediction markets. A lot of them are like currently there's no real money at stake. Something like Metaculus is a market that I see a lot cited. But there's no actual real money at stake. There is real money on Predictit for election stuff. There is real money on Betfair in the UK, again, mostly for elections. But I'm very optimistic about if you expand this just beyond, political horse races and the more policy effects and outcomes, that we can see a lot of things. And then there are crypto prediction markets that are currently less regulated that might be able to provide useful information as well. And so feels like we've exited the winter on that topic, but maybe I'm in a bubble.
Yeah. Well, I mean, policy can help here because the Predicted has, $850 limit on each bet, right? I don't know which agency you have to go to or which law you need to pass to just get government out of the way and stop putting those limits and letting people build prediction markets in freedom. But, maybe that's an issue you guys could work out. I think there'd be a great return to that.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a great point, and it's definitely in our wheelhouse. I believe that one is Commodities Futures and Trading Commission, CFTC. Okay. We haven't commissioned any research on that area yet, but relaxing the rules on that sort of thing would be extremely useful because, again, prediction markets are a form of a public good, and having that information out there, I think it's interesting that just take one example, in my bubble on Twitter, there's an extremely high confidence that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. People talk as if it's like a 90% plus outcome. That could be correct. I don't know. But I think it's interesting, and I have no expertise in this area, so I'm not making a prediction myself. But I think it's interesting that on Metaculus, I checked yesterday, Metaculus is only at 52%. And again, it's not real money, so who knows? At 52% for Russia to invade at any point this year before the end of 2022. They could be wrong. If there are real money at stake, maybe you get a different outcome. But it's a good just kind of reality check of is my Twitter bubble overconfident in the odds of an invasion?
But it's hard to know what the odds are because I think we follow a lot of the same people on Twitter, and I don't know if it's like 90, if it's like 50, so it's like a 50% chance there's going to be a war. That's huge, right? And so
it's only huge,
yeah. So are they talking in a way that's consistent with a 50% belief or a 90% belief? It's very hard for me to tell. like when they say Russia is probably going to invade Ukraine, like 50% is a big deal and, a chance of having a war. So do they think if you had to actually force them, I mean, that's the problem. You don't really know.
Yeah,
Like I can't
exactly.
say it sounds like 90% or 70% or whatever. I just have no way. They just think it's, there's a very good chance. And that's all we can say. So yeah, prediction markets help you sort of near on that. So yes, I do hope you guys work on that. I think that could be, probably, not a lot of political resistance to it and something that can do a lot of good. Let me ask you just a question on biosecurity. So, do you feel like this is my thinking of COVID has gone sort of in a it's developed over the course of the pandemic. Early, I was like big into state capacity and we needed to do a better job and all this stuff, and then I saw some aspects of state capacity actually I saw that we were not very good at doing cost benefit analysis and like this and so in that context like state capacity can be a double-edged sword. It could be good or it could even be bad. So something like Omicron, right? It's more mild. We caught it early, so we shut down travel from these countries. We disincentivized them from tracking new variants, and then we did more NPIs, which I think the cost benefit on those don't make a lot of sense. And if we just never known that Omicron existed, or we weren't finding new variants, maybe we'd avoid some damaging policies. Do you worry about like our ability to do cost benefit analysis and whether more state capacity can actually make policy worse if we don't get that fundamental issue right?
It's certainly possible. But I think at the federal level, the thing you want, I mean, I know that a lot of more libertarian leaning folks are worried about state capacity just in terms of, yeah, like lockdowns, the ability to restrict freedoms. Um, when I think of state capacity, especially in the context of CDC and FDA, what I'm thinking of is more competence and independent decision making and the ability to think long term and anticipate future problems. And so this often, I would style that as a form of state capacity. And to use the variance example, right? So I think probably the single most effective policy of the entire pandemic has been Operation Warp Speed. It
Mm-hmm.
got us 3 safe and effective vaccines in about 9 months. When the average expected time is years, if a vaccine is ever produced for a novel virus, and so amazing success, beat almost everyone's expectations. And the reason it was so successful is because it leveraged the demand pull power of the federal government. It's de-risking it for those manufacturers of saying, look, we are credibly committing to buying hundreds of millions of doses of a safe and effective vaccine. It's kind of easy to measure like what safe and effective is. A lot of innovations like the next iPhone, like it's hard to describe like what that will look like, but for a vaccine, how to measure like in a clinical trial what safe and effective look like. And so it's a perfect kind of candidate for advanced market commitments, this idea of promising, credibly committing ahead of time to purchase large quantities of a good or service. And should have done more. We need to do more of that. We need
Yeah.
Operation Warp Speed for a lot more things. And so I'm thinking of rapid tests. I'm thinking of medical masks. We need to be stockpiling these things so that they're really accessible. Obviously, the core problem here on at least rapid tests was that we didn't authorize enough vendors. In the peak of the Delta wave, we only authorized 3 manufacturers in the United States, and dozens were available in the UK and the EU. Again, they're not risk seeking; they're risk averse as well, and they're highly developed countries. But they just authorize more manufacturers, and rapid tests were available for dollars or given away, a few dollars or given away for free by the government.
Yeah.
And so, the ability to anticipate problems, stockpile appropriately, and use demand pull mechanisms like innovation prizes, advanced market commitments, milestone payments, things like that. That's the kind of state capacity that we're definitely interested in building up within FDA and CDC.
Yeah, I get that, and I trust you guys and sort of your ideas on these things. I just I just worry about our politics. Sometimes I worry like there's only like it's like a binary thing. Either you're like at zero, not worrying about it, or one, you're worrying about
Right.
it, and you're trying to do something smart, which is do the cost benefit analysis, do the stuff that works, and don't do the stuff that not works. And I trust you on pushing on that. I just so worry that like maybe we have to go to zero or one, and that's
Totally. Yeah.
the pessimistic
That's a
thing.
fair concern.
Yeah, that's a pessimistic view of our politics. But yeah, you're trying to make our politics better, so you're not gonna be as pessimistic as me, obviously, about what we can do. So yeah, so Alec, man, you're only again, this is like day 8, and so I'm mindful of your time. I appreciate you taking this time with us. So I'll let you go. Is there just my final question is what's your metrics of success? How will you know 5, 10 years from now? What's your sort of median projection? What would make you happy, and what would make you think you didn't live up to your potential? How do you think about sort of success, and then over the next 5, 10 years, whatever your time frame is?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I can answer that on two margin. One, well, inputs and outputs. Again, ideally, you just measure outputs, policy impact. It's extremely hard to know what the counterfactual scenario is, though we can't run randomized control trials on U.S. policymakers and how we impact them. But I would say having at least a handful of concrete case studies per year of how we actually move the needle on immigration, biosecurity, meta science. So we can point to particular pieces of legislation or particular rulemakings that we can see the fingerprints of our language in the actual laws that are passed. And a lot of that is things we can't talk about publicly necessarily, but if we can prepare case studies for our stakeholders and say, we talked to X person, we provided them with Y information that led to Z outcome. You can kind of paint a story of like how you actually are having policy impact and guessing the counterfactual would have been worse for the U.S. policymaking process. So that's the ideal way we'll measure ourselves, is actually just moving the needle on policy. Another way to do that is measuring inputs. And so our maximum long run steady state goal for the organization is to be up to 50 people, which is not that large for DC Think Tank. The biggest ones have hundreds of people. Mercatus, Brookings, AEI have hundreds and hundreds of employees. We think with our alternative model, with being a Twitter first, internet first, new principles from the ground up organization, our goal is to have the impact of a Brookings with 1/10 their size. And so we want to hire only superstars. We want to have people who can really lead an area for us and just kind of take over and be pretty autonomous. So we're not going to have a lot of management, minimal bureaucracy. Minimum viable bureaucracy is the phrase we're using internally, because you have to have some of it, obviously. And then leveraging partnerships. So instead of hiring dozens and dozens of more people, can we work with other organizations and partner with them to have policy impact? And so if we're roughly that size, having the level of Brookings impact, and there are particular case studies that we can point to of how we actually change policy, then I'll be really happy.
Yeah, great. So, is there anything you want to tell people before we go? Where can people find you? I mean, is there just anything else you'd like to say before we go?
For sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. This has been a great conversation. And I'll just say to your audience, please do check out our work. Our web domain is progress.institute. Our organization is called, again, the Institute for Progress. And then our handle on Twitter is just the acronym IFP. So go ahead and follow us on Twitter there. Subscribe to our newsletter. It's free. It's once a month. It'll be a short just update for you. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you all out there. And on the Twitters and in the discourse.
Yeah, and you didn't plug your own individual Twitter, but Alec's Twitter is great, and then Caleb Watney, right? Watney's
Yep, got it.
Watney. Yeah, you can find their Twitters, and yeah, we'll post the links to that. Yeah, Alec, thank you very much for joining us. It was a great conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard.